Well, this is one of my favorite scripture passages. It's a short psalm, 3 verses long. I think you'll see both the beginning and the end verses why. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity. It is like the precious ointment upon the head that ran down the beard, even Aaron's beard that went down to the skirts of his garments, as the dew of Hermon and as the dew that descended upon the mountains of Zion. For there the Lord commanded the blessing, even life forevermore. I think the reason I like it is that when I first ended up with this beard as a joke and people were trying to get me to take it off, which was just enough to make me keep it on, Dr. Erwin Britton kept quoting this passage. Every time I would see him, he'd say, when the going gets tough, remember that God pours his blessing upon the head of Aaron, and it drips off the beard and down to the feet. And every time I take a shower, I think of this particular verse because that's what happens. But the thing I'm most interested in is the beginning. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell in unity. And when we deal with the concept of brothers, we ought to recognize that we are not dealing in any manner, shape, or form with a racist or a sexual concept. We have preached every year from this pulpit that concepts like brotherhood, sisterhood, fatherhood, motherhood are not biological concepts at all. That some of the greatest mothers in the world are men. And that some of the greatest fathers in the world are women. That we are talking ultimately about an approach to life. An approach which reaches out and shares qualities which we list in these terms but are not related to one's gender whatsoever. And I think if we don't understand that, it is easy to misinterpret what I'm going to be saying or to put it into a category that isn't true. I think we have to recognize down deep that labels grow out of certain kinds of experience but are not limited to that experience. And that the sign of intelligence and the ability to understand deeply the meaning of life is precisely the ability to take something from a specific experience and apply it on a broader basis. And there is not a Mother's Day that doesn't go by that I don't say there are many mothers who are biological mothers who haven't got the foggiest idea of what it means to be a mother. And there are many mothers who have never had a child and who will never have a child who embody in every major sense of the word motherhood. And that goes for men and women as well. Consequently, when we're talking about this, we recognize that there are a number of terms, sisterhood, fatherhood, motherhood, brotherhood, which seem to be a part of our vocabulary and all too often have far too limited meanings. I'm impressed that when you travel in the Near East, everybody has a brother or a cousin. You can't go into an Arab country and talk to somebody that they don't have a brother in the business somewhere else, or a cousin in the business somewhere else, or they've got something that grows out of it and they use the term brother. I'm impressed that within the black community that one constantly refers to other blacks in the community as brother. I'm impressed that in the Southern Baptist community, brother is the term of endearment which is used between people in the same church. And they constantly refer to each other as Brother Lyons, Brother Welcome, Brother Wolfenden. And that refers not only to the minister of the church or the pastor, but to individuals who are within the church as well. If there is some value to the concept of brotherhood and the dwelling together in unity, I thought we might begin to pull it together just briefly. So the first point is that it is a relationship which grows out of the specific relationship of brothers, but extends beyond. Now, when you look at the biblical record, you recognize from the very beginning that brotherhood is not mentioned in the Bible except in 2 possible cases, and even there it's doubtful. This says something to us. We have a tremendous tendency to look to vast concepts and look at them and focus upon them and fail to recognize that you do not get to the vast concept unless you begin with the particular here and now. Indeed, when you pick up the Bible, the first concept of brotherhood that you find is one brother killing another. You're often a downer. Cain and Abel. And the question is raised by Cain after he slew Abel, am I my brother's keeper? Focused on by nearly every preacher in the generations, few have dared to ask the question that God asked. It's interesting, isn't it? We ask the killer's question. We preach on the killer's question. We identify with the killer's question. Am I my brother's keeper? But we fail to understand God's question in much of our life. Where is your brother? But we don't go much farther on down the line before we have a major battle going on between two brothers. My namesake, Jacob, which is the Hebrew form, Yaakov, of the Greek James. The supplanter, one who by craftiness and wisdom outdoes other people. Never been very proud of that background to my name. But you remember, Esau was the sort of slow-witted, dim-witted, hungry one. He had a compulsive eating nature. Some people have argued that he had epilepsy and had to eat a great deal in order to continue to keep the balance, and that when he got to a low point, or hypoglycemia, when he got to a point where his body wasn't functioning well, he needed some food immediately, and they point out that he took lentil soup, which is high in protein, and that's what he was after. And what did he do? Jacob, this brother of his, this wonderful brother who became the head of a whole people and so on, what did he do? He tricked his brother out of his inheritance. Sold it for a mess of soup. And then tricked him out of the blessing by going to his old father who was blind and couldn't see. The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau, because Esau was, as the English say, an hairy man. And Jacob, you'll remember, put wool on his arms so that they would feel hairy to this old father, who blessed him and gave him the blessing intended for Esau. Brotherhood, you say? How many times down through history have the brothers been the greatest battlers? The bloodiest war that we've been engaged in is the Civil War, which was between brothers, those who had a common history and a common destiny. Family strife is the most bitter of any kind. You can forgive almost anything except your brother or your sister. And when families begin to battle, it is extremely bloody. And this church and others have witnessed what happens within a church community when those who are supposed to be holding on to the concept of unity begin to battle. It becomes extremely disruptive. And things are said and hostilities break out. And when you look at the history of the world, you begin to recognize that brotherhood is an ideal about which we talk, but it has little reality unless we can sit down and truly deal with each other in the sense of unity and as brothers. Now, the Bible recognizes that the brotherhood is not, therefore, a concept which is nice to talk about, but a living reality. They apply the concept of brother to friends, acknowledging that a friend can be even closer than your brother. To allies, a covenant of brothers. And one of the words of Amos comes down hard on those who broke the relationship of brothers, or as we would say, brotherhood. That is, they recognize that in specific instances, it is true that brothers oftentimes in the ancient world and in the modern fought like cats and dogs over inheritance, killed each other off, slew their very brothers and sisters to protect their own rights to a throne or to a kingdom or to great wealth. But that in spite of that, there was a concept of unity, of harmony, and of background that extended beyond. And that is what they meant when they talked about brothers. Brothers are those individuals who share, in the best sense of the word, a common history and a common destiny. Well, that's not too difficult to grasp, and yet it's difficult to apply. In the Christian church, are we truly brothers? And what is our common history? And what is our common destiny? You see, we look at the black community and we see them now tremendously excited about roots, going back and finding not only in the churches their existence, but looking back to Africa, because there is a sense of history that's important to them. Every year, the Jewish community goes through a whole series of ritualistic reminders of the Exodus, the Passover, because there is a sense of history to that. And as I've said to you before, the Christian church looks not behind, but somewhere down the future, and therefore has almost none of the roots that Jesus talks about, and planting what is so futuristic that it has turned its back upon history. It has been so caught up with the concept of a sense of destiny that it has not realized that you forge your future and your destiny in terms of your past. And what makes a church like this stronger and ever stronger is that it has not failed to look back. It has not refused to take into account the good and the bad things that have happened in this community. But growing out of it, it has said over and over again in the 6 and 7 years that I've been here, from the time that I came, where there was a hassle beyond belief, to this moment, it will not happen again. Amen. Why won't it happen again? Because we now know we're capable of it and have control over it. So part of the dwelling in unity is not a phony sort of happy where you don't get down to the deep insides of an individual, but instead you reach out. In the New Testament, Jesus talks about brotherhood, and I think this is extremely important in the second place. The depths of brotherhood is the love of neighbor. Essential teaching. If you want to understand brotherhood in our sense, or the concept of brothers, you have to read the New Testament, where Jesus is constantly concerned not about your biological relationships, but about your spiritual, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and your neighborly relationships. Without a spelling out of those things, we are totally lost. What we are talking about here is that you begin to expand your horizons to reach out to those about you and to apply, whether it be a church community like Pine Hill, or a family community like Jim Lyons and Chris Lyons and David and all the rest, or whether it be you as an individual, apply the relationships which you have to those about you. You give not because it's convenient to give, but because it's right to give. You share not because it's convenient to share, but because it's right to share. You reach out not because it's convenient to you to reach out, but because it's right to reach out. You don't ask the questions beforehand. You do what must be done because it's right to do it. That's extremely difficult. And all of us have problems with that way. We begin to go things through our minds. We begin to say, oh, can I really do this? What's going to happen to me? What are people going to say? The people that are worried about what other people are going to say aren't committed to what they're doing. When you're right, you don't worry about it. It's only when you're partly wrong that you kind of get up all kinds of arguments for doing something. Isn't that right? The more you argue with me about why you did something, the more I know you shouldn't have done it. In your own mind, not mine. Now, you know that's true. When you really got to work on it. Now, this is the reason I'm doing all these things. I want to put my arm around you and say, hey, wait a minute. When you know it's right, and when you know you're comfortable with it, and when you know it's the thing that you ought to be doing, you just smile at me and say, I did this. I don't have to defend it before anybody. But when you start piling up all these things, then I know that deep down in your heart you're a little worried about what you did, and you need some support. Now, basically, counseling for situations like that is just putting the spiritual arm around saying, yeah, you're right. Forget all those phony reasons. You did it because it was the right thing to do. Smile and enjoy it. And if somebody else doesn't see it, smile and enjoy them. It's their problem. Now, brotherhood is reaching out with that kind of compassion and enjoyment of one another and recognition that there are reasons for doing things, and that when they're right to do them, you do them. I think also we ought to say once again, and we're talking about this love of neighbor, and we've talked about it a great deal, but it's nice to keep it in this focus, that how I treat you says more about me than it does you. And when I once learned that, it became much easier for me to take hostility. There was a time, you know, those of you who know me well, I have a very, very, very sharp temper, a very digging temper, and when I cut loose, it's devastating. Always has been. Anything that makes a good pastor sensitive to the needs of others also shows them their weaknesses. And if that sensitivity to the weaknesses of others breaks loose in terms of an anger temper, you step right where it's most hurtful, don't you? It's one thing to brainstorm and shoot at people and not get near them, but when you know where they're aching and where they're hurting and you're mad and you just take it and go right straight in with the shiv. Right? Now that I have done some things in my lifetime that if I could bring them back, I would, because during times of anger I have touched people at points that I should never have even acknowledged I knew about, let alone out of my own stupidity and anger and out of my own lack of self-respect and out of my own bitterness and my own hatred and my own inability to cope, hurt them as though it gained anything. Nonsense. You see, more and more the hostility which I direct towards others is a recognition that the hostility is within me. And the more I am able to love myself and deal with myself and hold on to what I am and have a certain pride, the more I'm able to share without hostility. And it's not a question of just smiling blithely when somebody is angry with you. I always ask, why are they angry? Have I caused it? And if so, what can I do about it? And if I don't feel I haven't caused it, what can I do to help them anyhow? But the thing is that people treat each other as a reflection of themselves. And the next time I challenge you, I just challenge you to do it in your own mind. The next time you start to explode, say, what is this saying about me? And you will find that you will be a totally different person. You have to be. Which one of you wants to see and be seen as that individual who is putting other people down? When you recognize, when you put somebody else down, it's an effort to build yourself. That all prejudice and hatred against anybody else is nothing more than a failure to appreciate what you are. And when you recognize that, then the next step is, how do you overcome it? And I think this is where Jesus helps us in the last step to understand brotherhood. You'll remember there's a tremendous debate in the New Testament. It's kind of a casual sermon today. I hope it's okay. There's a great debate in the New Testament about whether or not Jesus had brothers and sisters. It goes on down through history, because once the Catholic Church had argued that Mary was a perpetual virgin, you could never have brothers and sisters. Now there are two interpretations of the passage that says, three actually. Who are my brothers and who are my sisters? Your brothers stand without, in a number of passages like this. One is that they were cousins. One is that they were children of Joseph by a prior marriage. And one is that Jesus himself interpreted, the fourth, of course, being that they were legitimately brothers and sisters of Mary and Joseph. And that is, who are my brothers and my sisters but those who do the will of God? It is precisely at this point that the Christian church takes a step forward beyond a number of other approaches to brotherhood. For the imperative, the categorical imperative of doing the will of God over above my will, means that I approach things not necessarily from my own tiny little perspective, but I try to get a God's eye view. And that is a totally different picture. For not only do I recognize that how I treat you reflects me more than it does you, but I am forced to look at you now, if I understand this, not from my point of view, but from a creative individual under God's point of view. What did God mean when He created you? Ever ask that question about yourself or anybody else? What did God mean when He created you? And if I look at you from that perspective, I have a totally different understanding of you. For I am not, therefore, looking at your hang-ups, the things that I like about you in terms of your clothes or don't like about you in terms of your clothes. I'm not necessarily interested in your hair, whether it's long or short, up or down, in or out, I don't know, flip, flop, flip. All the things that go on, but I am looking at you at your essential being, the essence of your existence, and I am saying to myself under God, what did God mean by you? And then I ask that question, I enter into a different relationship with you. If God has created you the way He has done, then am I to fight with God about what you are? If God's created me the way that He has, there are things that I have to work on under God to improve myself. But do you fight with God about what those things are? Or do you leave it in trust with God? You see, I very seldom ever tell anybody what they ought to do. That's for them under God. I can make suggestions of what they ought to be looking for and trying to open up, because all the change that comes in my life has to come from me. You can't force it on me. And all the change that comes in your life comes from you. And all of the brotherliness and all of the developing in unity is to recognize that your life is your life. It may not be my life. It may not be my lifestyle. It may not be where I'm going. But if you are living to the best of your own ability under God, then I will look at you in those terms and understand it in that way. And if that isn't what a church is all about, if that isn't what a loving relationship is all about, if that isn't what happiness and joy is all about, and if that isn't what interpersonal relationships is, then I really don't know anymore. But ultimately, we've reversed the pattern. We've worked up to the fact that one sees people under God, but that ought to be our starting point. Once I acknowledge that you are a child of God, and under God have your own responsibilities and dignity and your own ability to put things into a proper perspective, then I can only stand there and say, praise the Lord. For what we share together is more than two human beings, more than two individuals, but it becomes ultimately a godly relationship. It was fascinating the other night, the last of our Wrangler meetings, which this group of clergymen get together, and they invited their wives. And the clergyman who had been married 35 years, turned out that he was one of the younger of the group. We had people who had been married 55 and 58 years and so on, but they were talking about new lifestyles, and this particular clergyman read a paper on changing family patterns in which he had talked about why he believed that the pattern in which he had lived was the right pattern. In the course of the conversation, I said to them, when they had quoted all the psychologists and all the psychiatrists and all of the things that were going on about why it was so important in this particular relationship down the line, I said to them, brothers, I could sit in any one of 1,000 different meetings and hear the same thing. Can any one of you give me a theological reason? A godly reason? Can you bring to my life a feeling and an understanding of why this is essential under God? There was absolute and total silence. 20 theologians, pastors, who probably in their midst had 500 years of experience, could not a single one of us put a theological reason onto that deep personal relationship. On the way home, Chris said, you know what I would have said? And I said, why didn't you, first of all? And she said, well, I don't know. These are all theologians and pastors and doctors and all that. Who am I to know anything? But she said, I would have said that the theological reason is not necessarily anything beyond the fact that when I make a commitment, I make it under God and to God. And that commitment is serious. Now that's interesting. And when you begin to understand the dwelling of brothers together, my commitment is to be what I can be under God and to love and to share with each of you what God would have me to love and share with you, to give and to receive from one another. And it's not a commitment which is just mine about me alone or you about yours alone, but it's a commitment under God. And because it's a commitment under God, I see a deeper relationship that transcends my petty self. God bless our relationship.